Well, good morning again, everyone. We are back, and what a wonderful and inspiring morning it's been so far. I want to thank again Governor Carney and our keynotes for leading us off this morning in the ACCEL CTR conference. One of the wonderful aspects of putting together this event is having the pairing of scientists and researchers from across the clinical and translational spectrum. And so throughout the rest of the day, you'll hear community engaged panelists, you'll hear research presentations, you'll have the opportunity to see poster presentations, and of course, our amazing workshops at the end of the day as well. So I'd like to get started with our podium presenters today. And these are sort of quick bites, quick snippets as to important work that's going on across the ACCEL CTR family. So to lead us off today, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Anne-Marie Brescia. Dr. Brescia is Chief of the Division of Pediatric Rheumatology and a professor at the Demorge Children's Hospital, as well as Thomas Jefferson University, Sidney Kimmel Medical College. Today, she'll be discussing synovial biomarkers in JIA, Juvenile Idiopathic Arthritis. And thanks, Dr. Brescia, and please take it away.
Thank you, Dr. Khan, and thank you for having me. So we're going to talk about juvenile idiopathic arthritis. Many people don't know children get arthritis, but actually JIA is the most common type of arthritis that affects children. And patients are usually look like this happy guy on the left side of your screen. He's happy, he plays, but he has a swollen knee. But unfortunately, some patients have many joints, swollen and painful. And you can imagine with this many small joints of the hands affected by arthritis, it's very difficult to perform tasks of a daily living for the patients. And so in all arthritis, there's inflammation of the lining of the joint called the synovium, and that leads to damage of the cartilage and the underlying bone. Next slide. So what we want to study in our lab is how to predict prognosis, and specifically this one prognosis course of outcome at the bottom called extended. And this is because these patients have a more difficult course and a less good outcome. And so early on, we categorize patients into subtypes based on the number of joints involved. And so by 6 months of disease, if you have 4 or fewer joints, you're called an oligoarticular arthritis. And these are pretty straightforward to treat with anti-inflammatory steroid injections into the joint and perhaps some advanced therapies, but not always. And if you have 5 or more joints in the first 6 months of disease, you're called a polyarticular subtype, and we actually treat these patients very aggressively right from the beginning. However, after 6 months of disease, these patients who look like they're going to be relatively straightforward to treat can extend and recruit more joints into the involvement of arthritis. This usually happens within 2 years of disease, but can happen many years after, even 7 years after. And there's been no good way to predict which patients will have this extended course early on in their course before it's clinically apparent, because perhaps we could offer other treatments early on, or at least give guidance to the families. This subtype actually has a worse outcome than the more aggressive early subtype. They have a lower scores on health-related quality of life measures, and they need joint replacements more often than those with polyarticular. And it's thought because these patients are so obviously severe from the beginning with the polyarticular that we treat them more aggressively right from the beginning. So our goal is to predict way back here which patients will have this extended course. Next slide, please. And so the cell type that we studied are the cells that line the joint, called the fibroblast-like synoviocytes, or FLSs. And these have been well established in adult rheumatoid arthritis to have an important role in the disease pathogenesis of rheumatoid arthritis. And so we believe they have an equally important role in juvenile onset arthritis. And so on your left is just a biopsy of the lining of the joint, and the FLS should be about 2 cell layers thick like this red bar, but in this patient, they're very overgrown and hypertrophied. These cells release lots of matrix metalloproteinases, other things that damage the extracellular matrix. So when they're all heaped up like this, they're pouring fluids and damaging cytokines into the joints. On the right is just a slide of these cells in cultures, and they're fibroblasts. Next slide, please. So using gene expression by microarray and protein arrays, we have been developing a biomarker panel on synovial fluid. After identifying and validating with internal sources, we validated the candidate biomarkers on an external cohort from Cincinnati Children's Hospital. Overall, IL-6, interleukin 6, was the most sensitive for predicting which patients would ultimately extend to a more severe disease course, and CD14 was the most specific for this. So we decided to enrich our panel by adding additional candidate biomarkers. Next slide, please. We assume that our cells all have the same characteristics because they're isolated from the synovial fluid, but FLS are actually a pluripotent cell, meaning they can become many different kinds of cells. Based on our previous studies, we know they have characteristics of cartilage cells. So we use the technique of single-cell RNA sequencing to determine if the FLSs are heterogeneous, meaning they have characteristics not just of fibroblasts-like synoviocytes, but of other types of cells as well. Next slide, please. So we isolated FLS from the synovial fluid from 3 oligoarticular JA, meaning 4 or fewer joints at 6 months of disease, 3 pre-extension, meaning we know these patients had a polyarticular course after 6 months of disease, but the samples were from before they extended. So they still look to the clinician and to the patient like an oligoarticular persistently, and 3 polyarticular samples. And so this is 5 or more joints at the 6 months after disease onset. So what should have been a single cluster of cells identified by a single color ended up, as you can see, being several different clusters identified by different colors. This demonstrates that the FLS are actually comprised of many different subpopulations of cells, making them heterogeneous. Cells grouped into a single colored cluster have similar gene expression patterns to each other and differ from their neighboring cluster of cells of different colors. Next slide, please. Each group of replicates was used as separate inputs into the SURAT data analysis package from Bioconductor. Pre-processing of the data includes total expression normalization and removing unwanted sources of variation. SURAT applies a graph-based clustering approach to partition the cells into communities. When SURAT performs a UMAP, which is what is shown here, the last slide was a Tisney plot, the UMAP is dimensionality reduction. So the graph-based clusters co-localize in the projection. This allows for a one-dimensional image of the cells in the physical space and correlates that distance to the other cells. So for oligoarticular samples, we see that all the communities co-localize together with a mild separation. When you move over to the extended to be samples, these JIA samples have more separation of clusters, while the polyarticular JIA samples from FLS have the most separation among their cell communities. From this data, we conclude that increases in heterogeneity of FLS correlates to the distance between the cell clusters, and this separation corresponds to the progression to more severe disease courses. Next slide, please. Cells were then annotated automatically using the single R data package from Bioconductor, which also provides cell counts for each subpopulation. SURAT integrated analysis was done to compare the JIA subtypes, and based on common sources of variation, allows identification of shared populations across the data sets. While many cell-like subpopulations were identified, the 3 most populated cell type subpopulations across all 3 JIA subtypes were identified as chondrocyte-like, fibroblast-like, and smooth muscle cell-like cells. Next slide, please. While many of the genes overlap, the unique genetic fingerprint of these subpopulations shows that even in a single uniform cluster of cell-like cells, chondrocyte-like, fibroblast-like, or smooth muscle cell-like, there is heterogeneity between the JIA subtypes. Differentially expressed genes were revealed within cell type subpopulations between these subtypes of JIA, specifically the extended to be downregulated collagen 1 and aggrecan or ACAM, and upregulated IFI27 and serpine-1 in the FLS-like cells when compared to the oligos, and collagen 3 and VCAM were upregulated in the chondrocyte-like cells and extended to be when compared to the persistent oligos. Importantly, these genes encode secreted proteins. Our goal is to see if these differences translate to protein expression and if these proteins can be measured in synovial fluid from patients with JIA. It is our hope that these differences will correlate to the various subtypes of JIA and could potentially be used as biomarkers to determine which course of JIA a patient will follow. Next slide, please. Based on our preliminary single-cell RNA-seq data, we propose these 6 additional markers. Using ELISA, we will measure the expression levels of these candidate biomarkers in our synovial fluid samples, both from the Nemours cohort and the shared external Cincinnati cohort. We'll determine if any of these additional markers could be used in combination with the earlier panel that I showed you to improve the predictive value of a multiplex analysis panel to differentiate between the JIA subtypes, and this will inform our ongoing serum biomarker feasibility study as well. Next slide, please. So our goal was to translate expression of these secreted proteins by the chondrocyte subpopulation in our FLS to detection in synovial fluid. As expected, aggrecan or ACAN and collagen 1 are overexpressed in the synovial fluid from 37 persistent JIA samples compared to 32 extended to be JIA sample, and vascular cell adhesion molecule or VCAM is overexpressed in the synovial fluid from extended to be JIA compared to the persistent JIA. Translation of these markers from the FLS gene expression to total protein expression in the synovial fluid will allow us to continue with our plans for conducting a linear discriminant analysis to determine if these markers can consistently predict JIA subtypes. An in-depth statistical analysis on this data as it's collected will allow us to move from isolating FLS from the synovial fluid to testing the total protein in synovial fluid samples, which is much more applicable to predicting for patients who will extend. Next slide, please. So our second aim was to define clinically relevant subpopulations of the FLS on the synovial fluid. And as you saw, the single-cell RNA-seq studies revealed multiple FLS subpopulations within the total population of FLS, and that heterogeneity was distinct based on the subtype of JIA. So we are planning to perform flow cytometry on newly obtained patient samples to help characterize the cell populations. Next slide, please. So taking these 3 subpopulations that we talked about, we calculated the percentages of cell types within each subtype of JIA based on the total number of cells and determined statistical differences between them. Each bar represents the cell type percentages. The blue bar designates the oligoarticular, the orange is the extended to be, and the gray is the polyarticular. And so you can see the oligoarticular has significantly more cells identified as smooth muscle cells. Pre-extension have more fibroblast-like cells when compared to oligo, and the polyarticular had significantly more cells identified as chondrocyte-like when compared to both of the other subtypes. So as the cells evolve towards more chondrocyte-like characteristics, their fibroblast-like cell subpopulations and smooth muscle cell-like populations decrease as the disease course becomes more severe, polyarticular. Next slide, please. And I will wrap you up to let you know our ongoing work. So the progress for AIM-2, we have, in collaboration with the UD Flow Cytometry Core, we've been developing a panel of surface markers to identify each cell type. Unfortunately, this panel of well-known traditional markers had quite a bit of expression overlap between the normal cell lines. So we're re-looking at manuscripts and our single-cell RNA-seq data to find some more specific subpopulations to use to identify these cells. Next slide, please. So in summary, the FLS are key effector cells in RA and have an aggressive phenotype that leads to joint damage. We think they're also a major determinant of disease extension in JIA. And we are trying to leverage this to come up with a panel and also perhaps a flow cytometry method for determining what subtype a patient will evolve into. Next slide. So this is, as you know, a community engaged project. And as we're progressing towards the development of a predictive biomarker panel, we need to hear from patients and families if and how they would like to receive any prognostic information about their child. So we're forming a small community advisory panel comprised of 3 to 4 parents of children with JIA and 1 lay member from the Arthritis Foundation. I'm on the Delaware Executive Board of the Arthritis Foundation, so I will partner with the new Delaware Executive Director. She just started after some changes over the pandemic. And so partner with her and through quarterly virtual meetings, we'll solicit the voice of the community on the packaging and communication of our findings in a way that will suit patients' needs. I've only asked 2 people so far. Both of them said yes, that they would be on it. One is a former patient and one is a current parent. And they say they would be thrilled to be on the panel. So hopefully we'll be up and running soon. In addition, we do a juvenile arthritis day here in the fall at Nemours. We do it in combination with the Arthritis Foundation, and we'll solicit the same information there. Last slide, please. I especially want to thank Meg Simons, who's my research assistant, who did all this work, and of course, the Delaware CTR ACCEL and our other funders for supporting this work. Thank you so much for your attention. Sorry, I stole an extra minute.
Not at all. Thank you, Dr. Brescia, for that wonderful talk, and again, for emphasizing how basic science in the lab can translate to clinical science, and all this is based on community needs. And the fact that you have included families in this important work, I think, is critical. And thank you for your long and distinguished service to children in the community, especially in rheumatology and joint disease, which folks may or may not know was actually the original and historic strength of the Nemours Children's Hospital. It started off as an orthopedic and joint-based center of excellence and remains so in many ways. So thank you, Dr. Brescia.
Thank you.
We will hold questions for Dr. Brescia towards the end, and we're going to continue to try and keep on time here. So we'd like to introduce now the next speaker. Dr. Shannon Virtue is from Christiana Care. She is the Associate Director of Psychology Training Program at Christiana Care. And today she'll be talking about a patient-centered perspective on managing type 2 diabetes during breast cancer treatment. Shannon, please take it away.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here and to talk about the research program that I'm working on and developing, and really to even kind of start the beginning of this work really began with me in my clinical role and listening to the individuals that I was working with. So I'm a licensed psychologist, a health psychologist by training at the Helen Graham Cancer Center. And part of my clinical work is meeting with individuals during their cancer experience to provide emotional support in that experience. And in the context of my clinical work, I started to hear and notice a pattern of a number of individuals sharing with me about some difficulties that they were having specifically in regard to managing their type 2 diabetes while they were undergoing cancer treatment. And this was a whole host of different things, from folks sharing with me about how they felt overburdened by now, having managed a chronic disease of type 2 diabetes, and then having to additionally take on a cancer treatment and cancer diagnosis on top of that. I had folks who actually had to be hospitalized for hypoglycemia during their cancer treatment, and coming back to me and sharing how difficult that was and surprising it was for them, because they never had to worry about low blood sugar. It was more about high blood sugar. I had folks, talking with me about just not really being sure about how to manage their diabetes, saying, I'm being told, I can't lose weight, so I should eat anything I can. And that goes counter to what I've been told for a long time about my diabetes. So just listening to folks really got me thinking, what do we know about how we can better support folks who are going through breast cancer treatment and also have type 2 diabetes? So I delved a little bit into what we know, why would I focus specifically, or why would we focus specifically on this population? Well, there is a prevalence and an impact to folks who have both type 2 diabetes and breast cancer. So in the United States, about 10% of the adult population has a diagnosis of diabetes. And with breast cancer, we're also looking at about a lifetime risk of about 13%. When we go more specifically into individuals who have both type 2 diabetes and breast cancer, we're looking at about 16% of the women diagnosed with breast cancer having a comorbid diagnosis of type 2 diabetes. So certainly the prevalence is there. Next slide, please. And this is just showing, the prevalence is there, and we would almost anticipate to see that prevalence growing. So as we've seen in more recent years, the prevalence of type 2 diabetes is going up in the United States. Next slide, please. And in conjunction with that, we're seeing advances in breast cancer treatment, early detection, improved treatment outcomes. So we're actually seeing a growing number of cancer survivors in the United States, which is great. And at the same time, what that makes me think about is we're seeing folks who are going through a really difficult experience of a cancer diagnosis, going through treatment and living longer beyond that, which is wonderful. And we also want to think about how can we support them into that survivorship with managing their diabetes as well. Next slide, please. So I looked into the research and wanted to see what do we know about comorbid type 2 diabetes and breast cancer. And there's a lot of really great research out there. A lot of it is focusing on what are some of the common risk factors that we see between the two conditions, what are some of the underlying biological processes, as well as some research looking at the impact of having type 2 diabetes on cancer treatment and cancer outcomes. Next slide, please. However, there's some gaps in the research. So all that existing research is really great and really helpful, but what I was not seeing a lot of was research on the impact that going through a breast cancer experience has on diabetes management, and specifically diabetes management behaviors. So what I call is the self-care behaviors, the things that the individual is doing or is being asked to do to manage their type 2 diabetes. When going through breast cancer treatment, some of the common treatments are going to impact things like our digestive system, our sense of taste, energy levels, all of those things, which can have a trickle-down effect on how we might behaviorally be managing our diabetes during that time. There's also some direct impact on things like blood glucose levels. So folks who have to take steroids during treatment are going to see their blood glucose levels go up. And what is the impact of that on the individual? And just in general, as I already mentioned, really some gaps in kind of what's the medical burnout? What's the burnout? What are these individuals experiencing in managing both of these conditions simultaneously? Next slide, please. There's a small amount of studies that have been done looking specifically at diabetes management behaviors during cancer treatment. And some of those studies, what we've learned from them is that during cancer treatment, we see declines in diabetes management behaviors. So again, when I say diabetes management behaviors, I'm really speaking to, these are the things that the individual is being asked to do to manage their diabetes. So this could be checking blood glucose levels, it could be exercise, it could be dietary behaviors. So what we see during treatment is that those behaviors tend to decline. Folks tend to report challenges managing their diabetes during treatment, and that those declines in diabetes management don't just magically disappear after treatment is complete. So this goes back to what I was saying before. We're really looking at folks into cancer survivorship. We can't just expect, great, you've made it through your breast cancer treatment, now go back to managing your diabetes as you were before. There's a lot of complicated factors, and from a health psychology perspective, we know if it was easy for to change the behaviors that quickly, that we would all be doing all of the things that that we're told to do or recommended to do in terms of our health and diet and activity levels. Next slide, please. Another big gap I was noticing in the research is, where's the patient? So when we look at the existing research on breast cancer and type 2 diabetes, there's really little out there that takes the patient perspective into account. There was a systematic review conducted in 2016, specifically looking at patient-reported outcomes in terms of cancer and diabetes. And they found only at this time, and this is a little dated now, I'm going back to, but at that time, only 10 articles that they found in this review that focused specifically on patient-reported outcomes in this population. And they highlighted this need for additional research that includes these patient-reported outcomes, that really focuses on some of these things that we need to better understand in order to help support diabetes management during cancer treatment. So that's kind of what led me to my idea to really develop this kind of program of research focusing on type 2 diabetes and breast cancer management. Again, listening to some of the individuals going through it, delving into the existing research, and then building from there. In talking about my journey in building this, I had a great idea. However, I needed some additional support in order to get some of this off the ground. So thank you to the Delaware CTR ACCEL program. I had a mentored research development award, an MRDA award, and was able to get some mentorship from Dr. Carpin on grant writing and how to take ideas and build them into a grant and into a research project, as well as just her expertise in thinking from this community lens when we're engaging in research. So through the MRDA, next slide, please. In addition to that mentorship, I was also able to gather some preliminary data to kind of support what are we looking at if we're going to delve a little bit more into this population. So with this really small, we did a really small just cross-sectional survey study with about 28 participants who were diagnosed with cancer and type 2 diabetes, and had them complete just a brief measure looking at diabetes management behaviors. And what we found from just, again, this is just a small sample that we found, that on average across those patients, they were sometimes engaging in the recommended diabetes self-care. Next slide, please. And this is just a table that had some of the behaviors that we were assessing and looking where folks fell. And so as you can see, it's not as though there was absolutely, no behaviors aimed at managing diabetes, but there were some places where we saw that folks were sometimes engaging in them, or rarely or even never engaging in some of these behaviors that are often recommended behaviorally for folks when they are managing type 2 diabetes. One of the ones that stick out to me, because anecdotally this was coming up with a lot of the individuals I was talking with, is treating low blood glucose, as a lot of folks had shared with me that this was something that was coming up during treatment, but they hadn't really, prior to their cancer diagnosis, hadn't really been managing as much. They'd been focusing more on high blood glucose. So, almost half of folks were never carrying some things to manage low blood glucose. Next slide, please. Also, just in this preliminary study, we looked at just distress, because what we do know is that when we're talking about managing any type of chronic health condition or having a cancer diagnosis, there can understandably be some distress that arises there. And this can potentially impact our ability to manage chronic health conditions, including type 2 diabetes. So we were seeing that, at least in this small sample that we did the cross-sectional study on, a good portion of them were indicating some anxiety symptoms and some depressive symptoms, which can, of course, also play a role in our diabetes management. Next slide, please. So what do we need to know? So we took that preliminary studies and thought, what else do we need to know? How can we better understand this? So really, I'm interested in looking at, across the cancer experience, how are those diabetes management behavior is progressing? Are we seeing continued declines? Are we seeing some improvements? And what factors contribute to either the decline or the steadiness of diabetes management behavior? And when I say factors, I mean, demographic factors, medical factors, because we can't ignore that, the psychological distress, and also access to things. We tell people to include certain foods within their diet, but do they have access to those resources? Next slide, please. So the current study that we have going on has 3 aims, and this is funded through the pilot program through the Delaware CTR. And what we're looking at is diabetes self-care behaviors across 3 time points during breast cancer treatment. We also want to identify factors, as I mentioned, that might be related to those changes in diabetes management behaviors. And then the third aim is to really hear the patient perspective. So determine patient-reported experiences and needs to support diabetes management during breast cancer treatment through qualitative structured interviews. So the study is ongoing, and we are actively recruiting folks for both completing the surveys as well as the qualitative structured interviews. Next slide, please. And so just to give you a little glimpse into what I've really been finding is kind of the rich portion of this work is some of the feedback from the patient perspectives. So we have a bunch of questions that we ask folks who have been so wonderful in giving the time to speak and really educate me and hopefully more broadly on what their experiences have been like. And one of the questions is asking about the greatest challenge to managing diabetes during breast cancer diagnosis. And as you can see, with some of the quotes that we have is individuals talking about having to take steroids, so prednisone during breast cancer treatment, and how that can drive up blood sugars and even really shift how they're managing diabetes. So going from managing it through medication to now having to take insulin. Other folks talking about eating properly, so getting enough to actually eat and drink when they don't have an appetite when they're going through the cancer treatment. Next slide, please. Other aspects that folks bring up is talking about the fatigue and how the fatigue impacts their physical activity levels, which had been part of their diabetes management. Other folks talking about difficulty checking blood glucose. Next slide, please. And just a couple more there. I had folks tell me, honestly, the diabetes took a backseat to the cancer. Maybe if there was a regular program that I could have attended to force me into some exercise program that was part of the cancer treatment, it would have helped with that. I think one of the main things is positive support, someone checking in with you, finding out how this is going. You need to know that you have help in this whole battle. You just need to feel supported. So we're working through doing these interviews and really better understanding the patient perspective. And I'm really hoping that in combination with some of the quantitative data will really help us better understand how we can take this patient-centered approach to helping support diabetes management during breast cancer treatment. Next slide, please. So as I already mentioned, we're currently undergoing with data collection on this study. Next slide, please. And I just want to say a great big thank you to the Delaware CTR ACCEL program for both the MRDA, Dr. Karpin for her support and mentorship in building this program, the pilot grant program that I'm working with now, as well as the Delaware IMBRI program. Part of that preliminary work was supported by some of the IMBRI scholars who helped with that as well. And of course, I just want to thank, all of the individuals, all of the patients who really got me thinking about this to begin with and are really contributing now on the patient perspective end. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you so much, Dr. Virtue, and thank you for your work in training the next generation of health psychologists as well. I appreciate your shout out to the Delaware IMBRI program, which is our partner NIH IDEA state-funded program in the state of Delaware, and of course to your mentor and our co-chair, Dr. Allison Karpin. Some really exciting work here. One question to ponder for later on in case we have time at the end of the presentations is applying some of this work to other types of cancers, for example, type 2 diabetes management and other types of cancers such as male-only cancers like prostate cancer as well. And of course, breast cancer is not a female-only cancer, although it is predominantly in women. So something to ponder for the Q&A session. Thank you again, Dr. Virtue. we'd like to switch to Dr. Scott Siegel. Dr. Siegel is the Director of Population Health Research at the Institute for Research on Equity and Community Health, IREACH at Christiana Care. Dr. Siegel is going to speak about a pragmatic randomized control trial of a precision pharmacotherapy hospital-based smoking cessation program, which I find particularly interesting, not only for the content, but also the idea of a pragmatic RCT is a relatively new one and is important for community engagement and operational research. Thank you, Dr. Siegel, for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Omar. If you could advance to the next slide, please. I have no conflicts of interest to report. Next. So by way of outline, I figure I will provide a background on this type of intervention, then I'll discuss the study design and our progress as well as next steps. Next slide. So first, by way of background, next slide. It's important to note that smoking continues to be the #1 preventable cause of early mortality in this country, claiming nearly 500,000 lives every year. Most of those through heart disease and lung cancer and COPD, as well as a number of other respiratory illnesses. Importantly, 70% of individuals who smoke are of lower socioeconomic status, and we see much higher rates among people who have chronic disease, including mental illness, and people who have housing instability, including the homeless. So this is a leading cause of early mortality that very much disproportionately affects marginalized communities. Next slide, please. So the link between socioeconomic status and smoking cessation has been pretty well studied at this point. And dispelling any myths that people who are of lower SES are any less interested in smoking cessation, the research shows clearly that individuals, regardless of SES, make the same numbers, are just as interested in quitting smoking and make the same numbers of quit attempts every year. However, individuals of low SES are less successful in quitting for a number of reasons. #1, they have less access to treatment. When they do have access to treatment, they are less likely to be advised to quit smoking. They are less likely to use evidence-based medication, and individuals in this group are more likely to report medication safety concerns and therefore are less likely to use medication or use it as indicated. And in total, this leads to lower cessation rates. Next slide. So one way that in the tobacco control world, the work has been done to try to address this is to provide smoking cessation interventions in hospital-based programs. And there are a number of advantages of doing this. First, there is a so-called captive audience. About 4 million individuals who smoke are admitted to US hospitals annually. So this presents an opportunity to ask and advise individuals about smoking cessation. 2, this has been described at times as a teachable moment. So patients admitted, particularly for tobacco-related conditions, may be more receptive to smoking cessation messages. And 3rd, hospital settings are smoke-free, and this may facilitate abstinence. Next slide, please. We have really good evidence that hospital-based smoking cessation interventions do improve outcomes, that they can be translated into routine medical care, and that they are cost-effective. And this is just one report from the Cochrane Library to provide background on that. There's been other research since. But some of the limitations of these approaches are that abstinence rates still, even in these programs, rarely exceed 25%, and that we do see even lower abstinence rates for individuals of low socioeconomic status and for ethnic and racial minority patients. A lot of this can be attributed to poor medication uptake and effectiveness in these populations. Next slide. So the opportunity is to develop novel approaches to increase the impact of hospital-based smoking cessation interventions for underserved smokers by increasing medication uptake and medication effectiveness, all with the goal of reducing tobacco-related health disparities. Next slide. So enter precision pharmacotherapy. Precision pharmacotherapy refers to measuring an individual's rate of nicotine metabolism and then providing a personalized recommendation for smoking cessation pharmacotherapy on that basis. Prior, very highly controlled well-controlled research has shown that by assigning nicotine replacement therapy, such as the patch, to individuals with a slower metabolism and varenicline or Chantix to those with faster metabolism, maximizes cessation outcomes while minimizing side effects. So in this graph I'm showing you here, this is from one of those RCTs. You can see that among slow metabolizers, the number of patients needed to treat in order to achieve one smoking cessation success is equivalent. That's not a statistically significant difference. So it would make sense to assign slower metabolizers nicotine replacement because, for number one, it's a much more cost-effective medication. And number two, although there was no difference in terms of outcomes, slower metabolizers who took varenicline actually reported more side effects. But among faster metabolizers, a group that has historically had a harder time quitting, you can see that providing varenicline, the number needed to treat is about 5 compared to when you provide nicotine replacement, it's about 26. So you can increase by a factor of 5 the success rate among faster metabolizers, smoking cessation rates, and you actually don't see the difference in side effect reporting that you do see in slower metabolizers. Next slide, please. So the questions that I had and which motivated this proposal was, can a pragmatic hospital-based precision pharmacotherapy smoking cessation be evaluated in a, quote, real-world setting? The research that I presented to you before were in highly controlled efficacy studies. We don't yet know if we can provide this in a community setting, such as Christiana Care, for example. And we proposed to evaluate this by looking at the enrollment and completion rates, as well as the representativeness of the sample who chose to participate in the study relative to the larger population. Next slide. We're also interested to know if offering personalized medication recommendations helps to address safety concerns and increase medication uptake, particularly for low SES patients. We have preliminary data from prior studies to suggest that these personalized recommendations do address patients' concerns, and that may lead to an increase in medication. So you can get a multiplicative benefit by both increasing medication and then matching the medication to the right patient. Next slide. Ultimately, we would like to see if providing a personalized recommendation does improve treatment matching. So providing a recommendation to a patient doesn't necessarily mean the patient will take that recommendation. So we were going to evaluate that in this trial by looking at what percentage of those who use medication who are slow metabolizers went on nicotine replacement therapy versus fast who went on varenicline. And next slide. The long-term objective, of course, is to see if this intervention can improve cessation rates and help to close the tobacco-related health disparity gaps. Next slide. So the study design. Our inclusion criteria were very limited because, as Omar noted, this is a pragmatic trial. So we were only required that our participants currently smoke, which we defined as at least 5 cigarettes per day, and were of age 18 or older. The exclusion criteria, which again, we tried to keep limited, was that any use of other tobacco products or contraindications to receiving medication, the inability to communicate by phone, or the inability to communicate in English or consent because of cognitive impairment. Beyond that, all other patients were eligible. And this is in contrast to many smoking cessation trials, which also limit people who have other comorbid conditions or including mental illness. Standard care, so patients are going to be randomized on a 1-to-1 basis to either standard care or precision care. So standard care is that patients were asked about smoking, advised to quit, and connected to treatment. On the precision care side, you would get the standard care plus feedback on metabolism and a recommended medication. And then our follow-up would be at 30 days, where we would assess use of medication, side effects, whether the treatment was matched, and for those who were reporting abstinence, we would verify that biochemically. Next slide, please. This is the timeline that I had originally proposed, where we were going to be approaching patients who were admitted in the hospital and then followed up post-discharge. Next slide. But we had to scrap this entirely thanks to COVID. Next slide. Some of you in academia have seen this Far Side cartoon before about what the process is to get a paper accepted. Next slide. I've adapted that for implementing an RCT during the time of COVID. There were a number of issues that we've had to contend with, including COVID-19 related hospital restrictions, hiring freezes. There was an FDA recall on one of the study medications, and a number of other issues. Of course, COVID has been an uneven process. So just when we thought we had things figured out, Omicron came. But I'm happy to report that actually we've been able to successfully navigate all of these, and we did get the trial implemented. Next slide. So our primary challenges were that on the acute care side, COVID restrictions prevented us from approaching inpatients for the study. So I'm happy that I followed Dr. Virtue, and she shared with you a little bit about her work at the Helen F. Graham Cancer Center and Research Institute. We were in a position that we had a different set of COVID restrictions on the outpatient side and a really robust thoracic program that screens patients for smoking. So this proved to be an ideal location on the outpatient side where we can move the study. In addition, relatedly, a hiring freeze at the beginning of COVID prevented us from recruiting a study coordinator. And because of the partnership that the Cancer Center has with the Wistar Institute, we actually had research coordinators who were available, whose time we could cover with grant funding. And so I was able to work within that arrangement to be able to bring on a study coordinator for this project. Once we had all that figured out, I was happy to see that the FDA had issued a recall on one of the study medications, Chantix, which is the one that's recommended for faster metabolizers on nicotine. Furthermore, although originally in the study design, we had participants were going to be able to access medication through the Delaware quit line at no cost, we learned from the Delaware quit line that even though the FDA did approve on an emergency basis the import of generic Chantix or varenicline, the quit line was not going to be able to access that medication. So we rebudgeted and worked with our own pharmacy so that we could purchase both nicotine replacement and varenicline through our pharmacy and provide them to our participants at no cost, which extended the timeline considerably, but we've been able to get that in place now. Next slide. So I'm happy to report that with all that, we were able to receive an extension until the end of the year. We were finally able to open the trial for recruitment a couple of months ago. We now have about 10 patients or so on trial, and we're on target with the recruitment rate that we have to meet our goals by the end of the year. Next slide. And I thought that there was some irony here because some of you may have heard the common refrain that it takes the typical smoker maybe 30 or more attempts before they actually successfully quit smoking. I have found that that same ratio may be true for implementing smoking cessation trials. So I take inspiration from this and hope that ultimately each of these challenges that we've had to clear proves well worth it. Next slide. And as far as next steps, continue recruitment and finish the pilot, fingers crossed. Assuming we can demonstrate feasibility, it's our goal to develop a proposal for a multi-site RCT. We have partners at Penn where my mentor, Robbie Schnoll, helped to pioneer this work, would be interested in working with us on this, as well as MUSC, where there's a very strong smoking cessation hospital-based program. We are also currently exploring the implementation of this approach at our Wilmington Hospital campus. Within our county, we see very high rates of smoking in Wilmington compared to surrounding areas. I just actually received interest from our women's health program too, about maybe partnering on something like this. So now that it seems like we've figured out how to do this there, and we're sharing some of our experience with others, we're garnering interest in possibly expanding this to evaluate on a larger scale, including with the Delaware Cancer Consortium, where there may be an opportunity to try to address lung cancer disparities within our Medicaid population. The next slide. So the lesson learned for me is never ever give up on giving up smoking. And it's probably true for lots of people's experience with research, is that it's hard work. There's a lot of challenges, but you know, this is very much a marathon and not a sprint. And this is where the gains come from, is you know, the persistence in the face of all these challenges. And with that, next slide. I thank you for your attention and for the support of the CTR program.
Great, thank you very much, Dr. Siegel. And Scott, don't go anywhere just yet. We have a couple minutes here, so as I mentioned, we'll try to get the panelists back on for Q&A towards the end. But let's try to sneak in a quick question for you here, if we can. We have a question here regarding whether you, and you may have seen this in the chat as well, whether the participants were part of the inclusion criteria were that they had to be English speakers in order to participate. Can you comment if that's the case, and how did the study coordinators come to that decision?
For this pilot, yes, we required that participants be able to communicate in English. It's a resource question. The hope, of course, is that as we expand, that we would be resourced well enough to bring in either to have a coordinator who was bilingual or just to simply work through our translation services.
Very good. Thank you, Scott. And again, really shows the importance of translational research that is just in time in many ways, and pragmatic trials are a way to certainly doing that. So thank you very much for your time, and we'll bring the rest of the panelists on towards the end, depending on our time. Wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
We'll go now to our final presentation for this particular segment. And Dr. Katrina Morrison, policy scientist at CRESP, is going to be speaking about that. And as you remember, CRESP is at the University of Delaware, the Center for Research in Education and Social Policy. Dr. Morrison is going to discuss exploring the health of Black girls in Delaware. Dr. Morrison, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khan. Good morning, everyone. My name is Katrina Morrison. I'm a policy scientist at the Center for Research in Education and Social Policy, also known as CRESP. And I have the pleasure today of presenting findings to you all from a project where we explored the lived experiences and perspectives of Black girls in the state of Delaware. This project was a true collaboration with many invested partners, including the Delaware chapter of the National Coalition of 100 Black Women, the Delaware Department of Health and Social Services, ACCEL, UD, including CRESP and Partnership for Healthy Communities, and Delaware State University. For today's discussion, I'll be focusing on findings that have implications for what we know as the social determinants of health. So that includes access to health, experiences with racism, safety, school experiences. And when I say health, I'm referring to both the physical health of Black girls and the mental health. So I'll be talking about how we conducted this research, what we found out from our interview findings and our survey findings, and what could be done in light of these findings. So in order to consider how we can translate these findings to action. Next slide, please, and thank you. So how do we conduct this research? Next slide, please. So we administered an anonymous online survey in 2020 and in 2021. And this survey was comprised of items from 4 separate instruments. These instruments included the YRBS, the Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance System, the PYD survey, which is the Positive Youth Development Survey, the KidScreen survey, and the PRACY, the Perceptions of Racism in Children and Youth. And together that made up our survey, and the data were analyzed descriptively. We also conducted interviews and focus groups via Zoom in late 2020, and the data were coded and analyzed thematically. So of note, we did collect these data during the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, when there were lots of shutdowns and social isolation. Our focal population were Black girls between the ages of 10 and 19 years old who live in Delaware. And we covered a number of topics, including physical health, nutrition, safety, school experiences, and supports that Black girls felt they needed. Next slide, please. So our research resulted in 6 briefs, 5 of which are based on our interview findings and 1 based on our survey findings. These briefs can be found on the CRESP website or the National Coalition of 100 Black Women Delaware chapter, their website. And these briefs go very in depth with our findings and recommendations. Today, I'll be sharing select findings from those. Next slide, please. So what did we find out? Starting with our survey findings. So this is to show you who we talked to and from where. So we talked to we surveyed a total of 186 girls. One of our girls didn't note which county they came from. But nonetheless, we see that most of our participants came from Newcastle County, and most came from the 10 to 13 age group. I'll make a note about our age breakdowns here. So the survey instruments were divided between the 10 to 13 age group and the 14 to 19 age group. We wanted to further break down the 14 to 19 year age group for our focus groups in particular, so that girls were with other girls who had similar ages and similar grade levels. So I break those down here in that way, and you'll see some of our findings broken down in terms of those ages, or in terms of 10 to 13 versus 14 to 19. Next slide, please. So one of our findings around health was that the amount of sleep and the amount of time on screens was of particular concern. So the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends that children ages 6 to 12 receive at least 9 hours of sleep each night. We found that only about a quarter of our 10 to 13-year-old girls were receiving the recommended hours of sleep. So that meant 3/4 of our participants reported not receiving those recommended hours of sleep. In terms of for older children, the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends that children 13 years old and older should receive at least 8 hours of sleep. And we found only a little 18%, a little above 15% of our 14 to 19-year-olds received the recommended hours of sleep. Okay, that meant the majority were not receiving the recommended hours of sleep. This is particularly concerning, knowing that sleep is associated with moods and academic performance. So we want to think about what's keeping our girls up and how that might be affecting other parts of their lives. We also found that a little over half our respondents said that they spent 3 or more hours on electronic devices. So this included social media. Again, the recommendation is 2 hours of screen time. So this is definitely over the amount of screen time recommended. And we know that we collected these data during the pandemic. We know that screen time probably increased, but it's still of concern to think about what our girls might be consuming and if it does intersect with some of their interruptions with their sleep. Next slide, please. So thinking about the environments in which our girls thrive and grow, we asked about girls' the extent to which girls agreed with whether or not they thought people in their neighborhoods listened to them or cared about them. We found that half of our respondents disagreed that the adults in their town or city listened to what they had to say, and half disagreed that they felt people in their neighborhood cared about them. So this is of concern to think about. These are the perceptions that our Black girls are having about the communities that they come home to. Next slide, please. In another environment where people are growing and thriving, we found that in school, most of our girls said they're doing very or extremely well in school. And we see the responses across the other categories. But we also saw that a third said they were very or extremely happy with their schooling. Looking at the other response categories, we see 18% that 18% said that they weren't happy at all with their schooling. So there's this disconnect between performing well in school, but then feeling extremely happy with their schooling, which was of concern. And even though the percentages are relatively smaller, we see that 17% of girls felt that they believed their teachers didn't encourage them, and 16% felt that only felt that their teachers cared about them. So or felt that their teachers didn't care about them. So although the percentage is small, it's still a concerning percentage to think about of perceptions that your teachers don't care about you or aren't encouraging you. Next slide, please. So the Pricey asked about whether or not girls experience incidents based on race. And we ranked these incidents according to the percentage of girls who said they experienced those incidents. So in this case, the most frequently experienced racial incident was hearing insulting remarks. 62% of our girls reported that. We see the next frequently reported experience was facing the assumption that you're not smart. Now the asterisk indicates the items that were only asked of 14 to 19-year-olds, but it's still really telling that over half of our 14 to 19-year-old Black girls faced those assumptions about not being smart. And actually, when it came to questions around racism, we found that more 14 to 19-year-olds experienced racial incidents versus the 10 to 13-year-olds. It's interesting to think about whether it's some protective factors around a 10 to 13-year-old or a different level of awareness. among the 14 to 19-year-olds. The Précis also asked about reactions and feelings in response to those racial incidents. And common feelings we found in the data were frustration, hurt, and sadness. And then common reactions were ignoring the treatment or speaking up or trying to forget about the treatment. Next slide, please. So turning to our interview findings, what did we find out? Next slide, please. So a similar breakdown to what I showed you around our survey participants, we talked to 70 total girls in interviews and focus groups. And we see similarly that most of the girls we talked to came from Newcastle County and came from the 10 to 13 age group. Next slide, please. So we asked girls about their eating habits and their habits around physical activity, and some themes emerged. So as far as factors that influence physical activity and nutrition, we found that people in your household have an influence. So what they ate, what they brought home influenced what girls ate, and then the activity they engaged in, their physical activity, would oftentimes rub off on the young girls. So if they were engaged in basketball, for instance, they would go out and play basketball with them. The girls' own motivation and interest and desire in eating healthy or in engaging in physical activity also played a role in their physical activity and nutrition. And also having enough time to exercise and prepare healthy meals. So if you have school assignments and extracurricular activities, those things might get in the way of having the time to exercise and to prepare healthy meals. And then having access to healthy, affordable foods and to safe spaces also played a role. It came up in some of our interviews that girls talked about their neighborhoods not feeling safe enough for them to walk around in, and that impeded on their physical activity. I have quotations in these slides that I'll give you moments to kind of take in, and then I'll move on to the next slide. Oh. Well, yeah, okay, thank you. These are shorter quotes. Thank you. Next slide, please. All right, so this quotation speaks to the finding that in some cases, social media interfered with our participants' sleep. And I'll give you a few moments to take this quotation in. Next slide, please. Thank you. So racism came up in our interviews as well. And our girls experienced racism in their community settings and in their extracurricular activities, but they also experienced it very much in schools. And specifically, they face stereotypes and assumptions about their abilities. The first quote speaks to a Black girl experiencing questions around her leadership capabilities. And the second quotation speaks to the perception and the experiences of having assumptions about intelligence. Next slide, please. So we asked girls about their perceptions of safety at home, in their communities, and at school. And what emerged were what I call 4 pillars of safety. And we found that what informed the safety of girls was, 1, having people around them that they knew and that they knew cared about them. Feeling welcomed and seen and valued as a Black girl was really important to feeling safe. The absence of anything bad happening and violent incidents made them feel safe. So that at school or in their neighborhoods or in their home, knowing nothing bad happened. And then, you know, some apparatuses that are often associated with safety, like security guards or equipment or dogs. The quotation to the left there speaks to the complicated nature of safety, where someone can feel physically safe, but not necessarily emotionally safe. Next slide, please. So what can be done in response to these findings? How can this translate to some action? Next slide, please. So I start with two quotations from the girls themselves. One speaking to the need for more mental health specialists in schools. And I think in tandem with that could be an addressing of the stigma and reducing the stigma around receiving mental health supports for teenagers and everyone. The second quotation speaks to the need for more diverse spaces for girls to socialize and hang out and just be. I'll give you a few moments to read those. Next slide, please. In terms of other recommendations, so around health, increasing campaigns that raise awareness around the recommended hours of sleep, recommended time on screens, and the influence of family members on one's physical health and nutrition. Those kind of campaigns can help change behavior, but as we know, behavior is influenced by environment and social conditions. So there also needs to be more safe spaces made available to Black girls and more healthy foods made available and affordable so that those facilitators of health can be there for Black girls to take advantage of. Connections to neighborhoods. So implementing more initiatives for Black girls to feel more connected and seen and celebrated in neighborhoods. And then maybe leveraging the leadership of Black girls so that they feel more invested and listened to when those events happen. In schools, creating task forces that critically look at existing policies and practices that might contribute to the mistreatment of Black girls, and then instituting policies that hold folks more accountable around the mistreatment and stereotyping of Black girls in schools. Next slide, please. In terms of experiences with racism, I think the previous recommendations could speak to that, but also increasing events and products in media that might inform the public about Black girls. And these things could not only help to counter any circulating stereotypes about Black girls, but also they could be used to inform the efforts of health officials, school folks, and folks in communities as they implement things to help Black girls thrive. And then in terms of safety, we need to recognize safety comes in all forms, not just physical safety, but also emotional safety. And increasing safe spaces definitely is in order, but also increasing platforms for Black girls to speak out and call out incidents where they feel unsafe or feel attacked. And then having platforms where they can socialize with one another and lean on one another for supports as they continue to thrive in the state of Delaware. Next slide, please. I end on a quotation from one of our participants that kind of speaks to this need to take up the charge of supporting Black girls thriving and health in the state of Delaware. I look forward to your questions, but if we run out of time, please feel free to email me. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you so much, Dr. Morrison, for your thoughts here and for this amazing work that you're doing. The final quote was indeed a very powerful one, that young Black girls have enough of a burden as it is, and simply the act of enjoying childhood is difficult enough and requires many social structures and social determinants to even make that happen due to their lived experiences in so many other ways. We have a couple of questions here, and we don't have a lot of time, but I'd like to get in a couple of questions here. But first of all, thank you again, Dr. Morrison, for your presentation. We have one here from Dr. Chen, which relates to, was exposure to violence explored by your team as it related to feelings of safety, sleep, and health? So exposure to violence, either community violence or direct violence, was that explored as a factor as related to feelings of safety, sleep, or health?
Not explicitly. This project was more exploratory in nature in that we asked girls about what made them feel safe in their neighborhoods, what didn't make them feel safe. So it emerged at times that if there was an incident involving guns or a lot of police presence, that made them feel unsafe. So it did emerge in our interviews. As far as asking that explicitly, that wasn't necessarily the aim in our safety research. It was more around, what are the things that make you feel safe? What are the things that make you feel unsafe? So definitely community violence came up, and it definitely contributes to feelings of unsafety.
Very good. Thank you so much, Dr. Morrison. Let me jump back to one of the earlier presenters here as well. Dr. Virtue, we had a question for you earlier on that related to your research on type 2 diabetes. And have you thought of applying this work to other cancers as well, such as, for example, prostate cancer, but really for any other types of cancers under active treatment, under similar types of treatment, perhaps such as colorectal cancer? And Shannon, if you're on the line there, you can feel free to unmute and turn the video on if you'd like. Hi, Shannon, you're on mute. There you go.
Yes, you think I'd be better at navigating all these virtual things by now, but I am not. So just kind of speaking kind of more broadly, I just wanted to put out there that I don't see the work that I'm doing in my project just focusing solely on breast cancer, that I really think obviously type 2 diabetes goes across individuals and across cancer diagnoses. And so I just there was a question about that, and just wanted to, about kind of the male perspective and the prostate cancer perspective, and wanted to say that I just kind of see this project and the breast cancer just as a kind of first stepping place for all of that.
Very good. Thanks so much. Certainly, I think the applicability of your work is broad across many different kinds of disease states, certainly in other types of cancers as well. So hopefully it can be a good template for this work as well. Let me jump back to Dr. Brescia and her presentation regarding arthritis, JIA in particular. Anne-Marie, you mentioned initially about the epidemiology of arthritis. We usually think of it as a chronic issue of older age. Perhaps, would you mind just kind of reviewing how many children are affected by different kind of arthritis compared with the number of adults that we usually think having degenerative forms of arthritis?
Yeah, so it's very interesting. In children, it's about 1 in 250,000 kids will have JIA. And so it sounds like a small population, but actually in rheumatology, since most of what we take care of are rare diseases, it's one of our more common things that we do take care of. And of course, as you know, both adult rheumatoid arthritis and osteoarthritis. If we all live long enough, we will probably develop some degenerative osteoarthritis as adults, all of us. And so it is a very small percentage compared to adults, but enough that it's the majority of our practice, to be honest.
Very good. Thank you, Dr. Brescia. And let me sneak in a final question here, one for Dr. Siegel. Scott, a question for you was, are you partnering or do you plan to partner in the future with the patient's PCPs in closing the loop on smoking cessation programs? And how have you found that partnership to be in terms of helping a patient quit smoking?
Yeah, great question. So for this trial, when someone enrolls, we collect their PCP's contact info and permission to reach out to them, because we provide the initial prescribing. But for patients who want to continue on therapy beyond that initial period, we aim to coordinate that with their PCP. More broadly in my conversations with PCPs, even though there's widespread understanding of how important it is to address smoking and that the evidence is very clear that we have tools that work, we still hear that, I'm sure Omar, you can relate, that there's so many priorities in those visits that there's not a lot of time to get to this, and that smoking cessation is something that may require repeated conversations. And can't necessarily be rushed if we're to do it well. So one of the ideas that we're also exploring with Shannon Virtue here as well is, can we do more in terms of prevention-based clinics where we might have different providers that would be close in communication with the patient's PCP, but who can kind of take on the counseling side and making recommendations about prescribing. So that's work in progress, and we hope that this trial informs some of that.
Very good. Thank you so much. We, as always, have more questions than we have time to address in this particular forum, which is a good problem to have. Karen, I believe that the presenters' contact information is online as well for our audience to access. And so we encourage you to please reach out to our colleagues. The whole point of making community engaged research presentations is to engage with our community colleagues and our audience. So please connect with them if you have ideas for collaborative research, if you have input for them as to how to include the community voice in their work. They are here to share the work with you. So I know they value your input and opinion actively. So please do connect with them. I want to thank again, once more, Dr. Anne-Marie Brescia, Dr. Shannon Virtue, Dr. Scott Siegel, and Dr. Katrina Morrison for your time, for your amazing work, and for sharing it with us today. Thank you very much.